The man had no ID, no wallet, no phone. Just a body that looked like it had been dragged through 3 countries before someone finally dumped it in the parking garage of Mercy Hollow General at 2 in the morning. The attending physician took one look and called it an overdose. The paramedics agreed. Even the charge nurse shrugged. But Sergeant First Class Lena Vasquez, who everyone in that hospital knew only as the quiet new nurse on the overnight shift, crouched beside that gurney and saw something no one else did. A breathing pattern that didn't belong to a dying addict. A muscle response that didn't match any drug profile she'd ever seen. And beneath the torn collar of his jacket, a tattoo she recognized from a classified mission briefing she was never supposed to remember. She had 7 minutes to save him before the wrong people arrived. If this story already has you holding your breath, hit follow, leave a like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the night everything changed. The rain had been coming down sideways since 10 o'clock, the kind of rain that soaked through a jacket in under a minute and turned the hospital loading dock into a shallow river. Lena Vasquez stood at the nurses' station on the 3rd floor trauma wing of Mercy Hollow General Hospital in Callaway, West Virginia, charting vitals on a patient she'd already checked twice because the numbers didn't look right and nobody else seemed to care. The fluorescent light above her flickered. It had been flickering for 6 weeks. She'd put in 3 maintenance requests. Nothing. That was Mercy Hollow General in a sentence. She was 27 years old and had been working there for 4 months, long enough to know which doctors were careful and which ones were cutting corners, long enough to know that the overnight shift ran on cold coffee and mutual exhaustion, and long enough to understand that her opinion, as the newest and youngest nurse on the floor, carried approximately the weight of a post-it note in a hurricane. Before Callaway, before the hospital, before the nursing credential she'd earned at a community college, while working 30 hours a week, she had been something else entirely. Army medic, combat deployed, 2 tours, 1 classified. She didn't talk about it. When new coworkers asked about her background, she said she'd worked in emergency medicine before nursing school, which was true enough to pass. The parts she left out weren't anyone else's business. She was reaching for her coffee when the radio at the security desk crackled. "We've got a walk-in situation at the ambulance bay. 2 males, 1 unconscious. No ID, no transport call. Just showed up." She set down the cup. Something about the way the security guard said "just showed up" made the hair on the back of her neck lift. She told herself it was probably nothing. Callaway had a methamphetamine problem that the county commissioners liked to pretend didn't exist, and the ER saw the results of that denial on a rotating basis. Unconscious men with no ID were not uncommon. She grabbed a pair of gloves from the dispenser on the wall and headed for the elevator anyway, because her shift was slow and the pull in her gut was hard to ignore. By the time she reached the emergency bay, the patient was already on a gurney inside Bay 3, and the 2 men who'd brought him in, both wearing civilian clothes, both pale and visibly rattled, were trying to leave. "Sir, I need you to stay for intake," the triage nurse, a heavy-set woman named Dolores, was saying. "We just found him," one of the men said without turning around. "Parking garage on Millbrook. He was on the ground. I still need your names and—" But they were already through the doors. Lena didn't watch them go. She was looking at the man on the gurney. He was somewhere in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, wide through the shoulders, even unconscious. His clothes were civilian, dark jeans, a canvas jacket zipped to the throat, but the jacket had been cut at some point and restitched badly, the way people sometimes modified clothes for tactical gear. His hands were rough, not laborer rough, the kind of rough that came from rope and cold water and years of gripping things that mattered. She moved to the side of the gurney and bent over his wrist to check his pulse manually, the way she always did before trusting the monitor. His heart rate was 42. Not dead, not overdosed. 42 beats per minute was the resting rate of someone with an extremely conditioned cardiovascular system, or someone whose autonomic nervous system was being chemically suppressed. She pulled back his eyelid. His pupils were pinpoint, bilateral. "What do we have?" The voice came from behind her, bored already. Dr. Garrett Finch walked into Bay 3 the way he walked into most rooms, like he was doing the room a favor. He was the attending on overnight, 45 years old, with the kind of confident indifference that came from never being seriously wrong, in a context where it cost him anything personally. He had good hands, technically. He was also the kind of physician who had stopped asking questions somewhere around year 8 of his career because the answers rarely changed his initial impression. "Walk in," Dolores said. 2 men dropped him. No ID. Finch glanced at the monitor. Pulse ox is low. Pupils? Pinpoint, Lena said. Classic opioid presentation. Push 2 of naloxone and get a tox screen. His respiratory rate is 14, Lena said. Not suppressed enough for opioid overdose at this level, and his muscle tone isn't consistent. Look at his hands. Finch looked at her instead. You're the new one. Vasquez? Yes. Push the naloxone. If he doesn't respond, we'll reassess. She didn't move immediately, which was enough to make him pause. Is there a problem? His jaw muscle response is wrong, she said. I want to check for acetylcholine involvement. This could be organophosphate or a cholinergic compound. If we treat for opioid, and I'm right, we treat for the most likely diagnosis, Finch said, and his voice had gone flat in the way voices went flat when someone was done being corrected by someone they outranked. Naloxone. Now. She pushed it. The man on the gurney didn't respond. 2 minutes. Nothing. Finch frowned at the monitor. Run it again. I already told you it wouldn't work, Lena said quietly. He ignored her. She went back to the patient and unzipped the top of his jacket to get better access to the chest leads. The jacket was heavier than it should have been. She ran her hand along the interior lining and felt something that didn't belong. A rigid panel, maybe 3 inches by 4, sewn into the inner left chest of the garment. Flat, hard, slightly warm from contact with his body. Not a phone, not a wallet. The shape was wrong. She didn't say anything about it. She just kept working. Beneath the collar of his shirt, just above his left clavicle, she caught the edge of a tattoo. Black ink, military style. She eased the fabric aside 1/2 inch and saw the design. A trident overlaid with a single star and a code string beneath it. The kind of identifier she'd seen exactly once in her life, in a classified medical briefing packet that she'd been told to forget. She had not forgotten. Her hands stayed steady. That was the thing about combat training. It didn't make you calm, exactly. It just made you move correctly regardless of what your body was doing internally. She stepped back and spoke in a voice pitched low enough that only Dolores standing beside her could hear it clearly. I need you to run a full cholinergic panel. Don't put it through the standard intake queue. Flag it personal. Dolores looked at her. Finch ordered, I know what he ordered, run the panel alongside it, please. Dolores hesitated, then gave a small nod and moved to the terminal. Finch had stepped out to take a call. Lena took the 30 seconds of privacy to press 2 fingers along the man's neck, then his wrist again, then checked the muscle resistance in his left forearm by lifting and releasing it carefully. The resistance pattern was textbook. She'd seen it once, in a training environment, during a session on chemical agent recognition that most medics never took, and that she'd only attended because her unit was being cross-trained for a deployment that ultimately got canceled. Nerve agent, not sarin. The degradation profile was different, something slower, more targeted, something designed to look like a medical crisis rather than an attack. Her mind went very quiet in the way it used to before things got bad downrange. Not empty, just organized. She needed atropine. She needed pralidoxim. She needed to get them into him inside the next 4 minutes, or the acetylcholine buildup would cause a seizure. And if he seized in his current state, he was not going to survive it. She also needed to do this without Finch seeing, because Finch would not believe her and would countermand the order before the medication cleared the syringe. She moved to the medication cart with the specific unhurried efficiency that she'd learned made people assume you'd already been given permission for what you were doing. She pulled atropine. She pulled pralidoxime. She drew them into separate syringes with the labels facing away from the door. Vasquez. She turned. Finch was back in the doorway. What are you drawing? She looked at him steadily. Atropine. For what? Cholinergic toxidrome. His secretions are increasing and his bradycardia isn't resolving. I think... You think, he said. You think. You've been a nurse for what, 8 months? And you think. 4 months at this hospital, she said. 7 years before that in emergency medicine. Where? She held his gaze. Army. He stared at her for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not respect, not quite, but a recalculation. Then it closed back over. Put the syringes down. I'm the attending. I'll decide when we escalate. The monitor behind her changed pitch. Everyone in the room heard it. The patient's heart rate had dropped to 28. He's bradying down, Dolores said from across the room. Put the syringes down, Finch repeated, louder. Lena set them on the edge of the cart instead of back in the tray, and that single inch of defiance was enough to make Finch's expression go hard. Vasquez, I will have you removed from this floor. His heart rate is 28, she said. By the time you remove me and find someone else who can recognize what's happening, he'll be dead. Silence. The monitor beeped. 26. I need 30 seconds, she said. If I'm wrong, fire me in 30 seconds. Finch didn't answer. He also didn't move. She administered the atropine, then the pralidoxim. Then she stood back and watched the monitor and kept her breathing even, and did not look at Finch because looking at him would not help. 40 seconds passed that felt like much longer. The heart rate climbed. 31, 35, 40, 48. The patient's chest expanded with a full breath, the first real full breath since he'd arrived. Nobody in the room said anything. Lena stripped her gloves and dropped them in the biohazard bin. He's going to need continuous atropine titration and monitoring for rebound. I'd recommend ICU transfer. Finch was looking at the monitor with an expression she couldn't fully read. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, though it hadn't become warm. I'll write the orders. He left the room. Lena exhaled. Dolores touched her arm briefly. Nice catch. Lena shook her head once, not dismissively, just honestly. It wasn't a catch. I knew what it was. She stayed in Bay 3 for another 20 minutes, watching the patient stabilize. His color improved. His muscle response normalized incrementally. He was not going to wake up in the next hour, but he was going to wake up, which had not been true 45 minutes ago. She was updating his chart, still under unknown male, no identification, when his hand moved. She looked down. His fingers were closing slowly around her wrist. Not grabbing, gripping. The specific grip of someone who needed to be certain they were making contact before they spent the energy to speak. She leaned in. His eyes were open. Barely. Glassy and unfocused, but oriented. She could see the orientation in the tiny movement of his pupils, the way they tracked to her face. Don't. His voice was barely a sound. Don't let them. Take me. You're in a hospital, she said. You're stable. You're safe. Not. A pause, a long one. Not safe. Tell no one. His grip tightened fractionally. Protocol. 17. November. She didn't write it down. She filed it. What's your name? She asked. His eyes were already closing. Harmon, he breathed. Vice Admiral, James, Harmon. And then his hand went slack and he was unconscious again, and Lena straightened up and stood very still beside the gurney and thought about what it meant that a Vice Admiral of the United States Navy had just been delivered to a small regional hospital in West Virginia with a nerve agent in his system, no identification, and 2 men who ran before anyone could take their names. She thought about the device sewn into his jacket. She thought about the men who had dropped him off and disappeared. She was still thinking about it when the ambulance bay doors opened again and 4 men walked in who were not paramedics and not police and not anything she could immediately categorize except wrong. They wore suits, expensive ones, government credentials on lanyards. One of them was on a phone. Another was scanning the room in the specific way that had nothing to do with looking for a nurse's station and everything to do with establishing sight lines. The one in front stopped at the triage desk. We're here to collect a patient, transferred from federal custody. Dolores looked at Lena. Lena looked at the man on the gurney behind her and at the jacket folded on the chair beside him and at the hard panel sewn into its lining that she had not yet examined and that no one else had noticed. Then she looked at the 4 men in suits. The one who had been scanning the room had just found her. He was looking at her with the flat attention of someone cataloging a variable. She smiled at him the way she smiled at family members in waiting rooms. Neutral, practiced, professionally uninformative. "I'll let the attending know you're here," she said to the man at the desk, and walked calmly toward the hallway. And the moment she was out of sight, she moved. She had 4 minutes, maybe 5, before they came back to Bay 3 and found him. The credentials were wrong. She hadn't been able to read the specific agency insignia, but the formatting was off in a way that was hard to articulate and easy to recognize if you'd spent time around actual federal personnel. Real transfer orders came through hospital administration. Real federal agents did not show up at 2 in the morning without a prior notification chain. She had to know what was in that vest. She turned back. The door to Bay 3 was still closed. She pushed through it, crossed to the chair, lifted the jacket, and found the interior panel by touch. Same as before. There was a seam along the top edge, restitched more recently than the rest of the lining. She pressed the panel and felt it give slightly under pressure at one corner. A data module. Ruggedized. Military spec. The kind that required biometric authentication or a specific cipher key and would not open for her under any circumstances. But also the kind that was designed to survive almost anything short of a direct explosive event. She looked at the unconscious man on the gurney. Protocol 17 November. A protocol designation. She didn't know what it meant, but he'd been coherent enough in the 30 seconds of consciousness he'd managed to use those specific words, which meant they were the most important thing he could communicate before losing the ability to communicate anything. She slid the jacket over her arm and beneath her scrub top, against her side, and held her elbow against it to keep it flat, and walked out of Bay 3 in the direction of the supply corridor. The door to the ambulance bay opened behind her. She heard the man in the front suit say, "Bay 3. "Which one is Bay 3? She was already around the corner. The supply corridor was 40 feet long and ended at a stairwell door. She pushed through it and descended one level to the basement, where the morgue and the equipment storage and the maintenance access tunnels lived, and where the overnight staff almost never went unless they had a specific reason. She put her back against the concrete wall and stood in the dark with the jacket pressed against her ribs and thought about what she was doing. She was obstructing a potential federal operation. She was removing a patient's personal effects from a secure treatment area. She was in a hospital basement at 2:15 in the morning, holding a piece of military-grade encrypted hardware that had probably been inside the lining of a vice admiral's jacket for a very specific reason that he had not had time to explain. And the 4 men upstairs who were looking for him did not feel like protection. She pulled out her phone. No signal in the basement. That was normal. The concrete was thick. She'd have to go back up or find the maintenance office on the sublevel where there was a landline. She was 3 steps toward the maintenance office when the stairwell door above her opened. Footsteps. More than one person. Moving fast, not carefully. The walk of people who were sure of themselves in a space they'd already mapped. She killed the light on her phone screen and stood absolutely still in the dark. The footsteps stopped at the landing above. "Basement's clear." A voice. Male. No particular accent. "Check anyway." A different voice. This one she recognized. It was the one who had been doing the room scan. She pressed herself against the wall and did not breathe loudly, and listened to them come down the stairs and thought, with a clarity that surprised her even now, that she had been in worse situations than this. Not many, but some. The door at the bottom of the stairwell opened. A flashlight beam swept the corridor. She was already inside the equipment storage room to her left, door pulled almost shut, watching the beam move through the 2-inch gap. "Nothing. Keep going. Check the morgue access." The beam moved away. She waited until she couldn't hear them anymore, and then she moved back to the stairwell, up 2 floors, not 1, emerging into the second-level corridor that connected to the administrative wing, where the overnight security office had a direct landline to the county sheriff. And, if she remembered the emergency contact board correctly, a federal liaison number for exactly the kind of situation that the hospital's administration had probably never imagined would actually occur. She had to find someone she could trust. She had to figure out who these men were before she made a call that pointed the wrong people at a vice admiral who had woken up just long enough to tell her not to let anyone take him. And she had maybe 3 minutes before someone on the floor realized she was gone and started asking questions she couldn't answer yet. She reached the second-floor landing and pushed through the door into the corridor and stopped. The man from the lobby, the one who had been scanning for sightlines, was standing at the end of the hall. He was looking directly at her, and he was already reaching into his jacket. And Lena made a decision in the half-second she had before the decision made itself. She didn't run, and she didn't freeze, and she didn't do the thing that most people would have done, which was put her hands up and wait to see what happened next. She turned left, not sprinting, walking fast, the way people walked in hospitals when something was urgent, but they didn't want to start a panic. Her shoes were soft-soled, and the linoleum was wet from someone's mop bucket, and she nearly lost her footing at the corner but caught herself on the wall with her free hand and kept moving. Behind her, she heard the man's footsteps start. He wasn't running either. That was worse in a way. Running meant panic. Not running meant he had a plan. She turned into the main corridor of the second floor and pushed open the door to the family consultation room on her right, a small, windowless space with 4 chairs and a box of tissues on a side table used for delivering bad news, and pulled the door shut behind her and stood with her back against it in the dark. She counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. His footsteps passed the door without slowing. She breathed out through her nose. He either hadn't seen which door she'd taken or he was walking past to cut her off at the other end of the corridor. She gave herself 10 seconds to think clearly, because that was all she could afford. The jacket was still under her arm, pressed against her ribcage. She could feel the hard rectangle of the data module through the fabric. Whatever was on it, James Harmon had sewn it into his clothing and taken a nerve agent to the chest rather than let someone take it from him. That told her more about its value than anything else could. She needed a phone with a clean line. She also needed to know who she was calling, because calling the wrong number in the next 20 minutes would end this badly. Protocol 17 November. She turned the phrase over again. Military protocols were usually numerical designations, not alphanumeric. 17 November was either a date or a designation she'd never been briefed on, which was more likely. She'd been Army, not Navy, and whatever Harmon was involved in operated in a lane she'd never directly occupied. But he'd said it to her, deliberately, which meant he'd assessed her in the 30 seconds he had conscious and decided she was someone who could do something with it. She pulled out her phone. Still 1 bar on the second floor, marginal. She opened the browser and typed Protocol 17-NUS Navy and got nothing useful in the 2 seconds she waited before the signal dropped. She closed the browser. There was a man in the building who wanted something from a critically ill patient who had specifically said, "Don't let them take me," and she was standing in a dark family consultation room trying to research naval protocols on a phone with 1 bar. This was not a situation that was going to resolve through research. She needed Marcus. Marcus Tully was the overnight security supervisor at Mercy Hollow General, a 53-year-old former Kanawha County Sheriff's deputy who had worked hospital security for 11 years because his knees had given out and he still needed the insurance. He was not a complicated man. He liked bad television and decent coffee and was genuinely kind to patients in the way some people were kind automatically without thinking about it. He also still carried himself like law enforcement and had, on 2 separate occasions that Lena had personally witnessed, de-escalated situations in the ER that could have gone badly wrong. More importantly, he kept a radio on a county emergency frequency that wasn't routed through the hospital's main communications system. She moved. She went back through the family consultation room door, checked the corridor, clear, and went the opposite direction from where the suited man had gone, down the back stairwell, to the ground level and through the rear service corridor that connected to the security office near the loading dock. The office was a converted supply closet with 2 monitors, a mini fridge, and a desk that Marcus had covered in so many sticky notes it looked like a confession wall. He was there, reading something on his phone, which he put down quickly when she came through the door. "Vasquez, why do you look like that?" "I need your radio," she said. "The county one." He didn't reach for it immediately. "What happened?" "The patient in Bay 3. The walk-in. He's Vice Admiral James Harmon." Marcus stared at her. "There are 4 men upstairs claiming to be federal agents who want to take him into custody. The transfer didn't come through administration. One of them followed me to the second floor, and I lost him in the corridor. She set the folded jacket on the edge of his desk. He's got an encrypted data module sewn into this. He woke up long enough to tell me not to let anyone move him. Marcus looked at the jacket. He looked at her. He had the expression of a man whose quiet night had just become something else entirely. You're sure about the rank? He told me himself. He was conscious? 30 seconds, maybe less. He reached for the radio. Who are you calling? She asked. My old sergeant is with the state police. She's got federal liaison contacts who aren't... He paused, choosing his words. Who have a different chain than whatever those men upstairs are using? How fast? 20 minutes to get someone here if she picks up. She picks up. 20 minutes was a long time. Okay, Lena said. Make the call. I'm going back upstairs. To do what? Make sure they can't move him before your contact gets here. Marcus looked at her with something she'd seen before on the faces of people who'd served. A recognition, a recalibration, a decision about who they were dealing with. You were more than a medic, he said. She didn't answer that. Make the call. She left the jacket with him. The module was what mattered, and it was safer away from her in case the man in the corridor found her again, and went back through the service hallway and up the stairs to the 3rd floor. Bay 3 was not where she'd left it, in the sense that everything about it had changed. The curtain was drawn. 2 of the suited men were positioned outside it in the posture of people who were not waiting but occupying. A 3rd was at the nurse's station, talking to Dolores in a low voice that Dolores was clearly not comfortable with. Her shoulders were up near her ears, and she was nodding in the mechanical way people nodded when they wanted someone to stop talking to them. Lena clocked all of this in the 2 seconds it took her to round the corner, and then she kept walking past the station toward the medication room without slowing, close enough to catch 3 words of what the man was saying to Dolores. Access to records. She went into the medication room and stood at the counter and pretended to check a chart and thought fast. They hadn't moved him yet. That meant either the transfer logistics weren't ready or something was slowing them down. Maybe the attending's signature requirement, maybe the lack of proper documentation, maybe both. Finch would require paperwork to release a patient, even under federal pressure. He was arrogant, but he was also meticulous about liability. And releasing an unidentified critical patient without signed transfer documentation was the kind of thing that ended medical careers, which meant she had a window. Not a wide one. She needed to do 2 things, delay the paperwork and stay visible enough that the men in suits couldn't do anything overt without witnesses. She went back to the nurse's station. Dolores looked at her with naked relief. The man who'd been talking to her turned. He was younger than she'd expected up close. Early 30s, square-jawed, the kind of face that had learned stillness as a professional tool. His lanyard said Thornton D. No agency name, just a 6-digit credential number below it. Nurse, he said. Can I help you? She looked at him with the specific neutral attention she'd practiced for years on people she didn't trust. The patient in Bay 3 is being transferred under federal supervision. I need the attending physician's signature on a form 2241-B. I'll let Dr. Finch know, she said. He's with a patient. How long? Hard to say. I wouldn't interrupt him mid-procedure. She smiled at Thornton the same way she'd smiled at him in the bay downstairs. Uninformative, professional, briefly. I'll pass the message as soon as he's available. She moved away before he could respond. Finch was not with a patient. Finch was in the attending lounge on the far end of the floor, which she confirmed by checking the break room window as she passed. She did not tell him about the form. She went instead to the supply station at the far end of the ward and stood where she could see Bay 3 without being directly visible from it. And she pulled up Harmon's chart on the mobile terminal and began documenting the last hour's treatment notes in detail. Not because the notes couldn't wait, but because having a visible professional reason to be at that terminal meant no one could ask her to move without drawing attention. 12 minutes passed. She documented. She watched. The 2 men outside Bay 3 remained in position. Thornton had gone back toward the elevator, probably to track down Finch himself. On minute 13, the man who had followed her to the 2nd floor came back through the stairwell door. He'd found someone. Not a hospital employee. Another suited figure, shorter, older, with the kind of posture that meant authority rather than enforcement. This one didn't have a visible lanyard. He walked directly to Bay 3, pushed through the curtain without pausing, and came back out 30 seconds later with an expression that Lena, from 40 feet away, could not read but could feel. Something had changed. She looked at her phone under the counter level. Marcus had texted, "Contact reached, ETA 18 minutes, keep him in the building, 18 minutes." The older man, no lanyard, authority posture, was now on a phone call, turned toward the wall. The two positioned men outside Bay 3 had gone inside. That was wrong. 2 guards outside meant controlled access. 2 guards inside meant they were preparing to move. She walked toward Bay 3. The curtain was half open. She pushed through it with the deliberate energy of someone responding to a clinical alert and stopped at the foot of the gurney. Harmon was exactly as she'd left him, unconscious, intubated, monitors running. One of the 2 men inside was checking the IV lines, not medically, checking them the way you checked something you were about to disconnect. "What are you doing?" she said. The man looked up. He wasn't Thornton. He was older, with a heavy jaw and the specific blankness of someone who had been told to complete a task and had bracketed every other consideration outside that instruction. "Patient prep for transfer," he said. "He's intubated. You can't move him without a portable ventilator and a transport nurse. Has anyone ordered transport equipment?" The man glanced at his colleague. "Has anyone ordered it?" she said again. "That's being arranged. It takes 40 minutes minimum to prep a critical intubated patient for transport. I'm the nurse of record on this case, and I have to sign off on transfer readiness." She crossed to the monitor and began methodically checking settings that did not need to be checked. "I'll need to see the receiving facility's documentation and a signed physician order before I can clear him." "Ma'am." "I'm not your ma'am," she said, still checking the monitor. "I'm the nurse who kept him alive an hour ago while your people were in the parking lot, so I'd appreciate it if you'd let me do my job." Silence. She felt both of them looking at her back, and she kept her eyes on the monitor and her hands moving. The curtain moved. Thornton came in. "What's the delay?" he said, not to her. "Nurse says we need transport documentation." Thornton looked at Lena. She turned around. "Standard protocol for intubated critical transfer. I'm sure your team is familiar with it." His jaw was tight. "We have authorization." "From who?" A pause that was 1 beat too long. "From the appropriate federal authority." "I'd need that in writing, signed by the attending. You can speak to Dr. Finch." She picked up the chart from the hook at the foot of the gurney and held it against her chest. "I'll page him." She paged Finch with a Priority 2 code that would bring him to Bay 3 within 5 minutes, because Priority 2 meant the patient was at risk, and Finch, whatever his shortcomings, would not ignore a Priority 2 from a bed he was responsible for. Thornton's expression did something complicated. He stepped back outside the curtain and made another call. The man with the heavy jaw had stopped touching the IV lines. Lena stayed at the bedside and watched the monitor, and kept her breathing even, and thought about the fact that Marcus's contact had said 18 minutes, and 7 of those had already passed. Finch arrived in 4. He came through the curtain with the slightly aggressive energy of a man who'd been interrupted and was prepared to demonstrate his irritation, and then he saw the 2 suited men and recalibrated. "What's this?" he said. "Federal patient transfer," Thornton said, appearing behind him from outside the curtain. "We have authorization, and we need your signature on the release form." Finch looked at the form Thornton held out. He looked at the patient. He looked at Lena in a way that asked something she answered by keeping her face neutral. "Who's the receiving facility?" Finch said. "Federal Medical Center." "Which one?" Another too long pause. "That's classified." Finch had many flaws. Lack of thoroughness was not one of them. He set the form on the foot of the gurney. "I can't release a critical intubated patient to an unspecified facility. I need a destination, a receiving physician's name, and a transport plan." "Doctor, this is a federal—" "I heard you the first time," Finch said, and his voice had an edge that Lena had only heard from him once before, directed at a pharmaceutical rep who'd shown up unannounced. "This patient came in without identification, without documentation, and without a transfer order through administration. Whoever you work for, you don't get to walk into my hospital at 2 a.m. and take a critical patient without the proper chain. Get me a destination and a receiving physician's name, and I'll have the form signed within the hour." Thornton's phone buzzed. He looked at it, then he looked at Finch, then he looked at Lena. "Step outside," he said to his colleague. The man with the heavy jaw moved past Finch toward the curtain. Thornton said, "I need a moment alone with the patient." "No," Lena said. Both men looked at her. "He's intubated and unresponsive. He can't consent to a private consultation, and as his nurse of record, I'm not leaving the bedside while he's in a compromised state." She moved to the head of the gurney, positioning herself between Thornton and Harmon in a way that was completely defensible professionally and completely deliberate. "Dr. Finch, did you want to discuss the transport requirements?" Finch looked at her for a long moment. Something was working behind his eyes. He was smart enough to recognize that something was off here, even if he didn't know what. He was also, she realized, just slightly afraid. Not of her. Of the situation, the shape of it, the federal credentials and the middle-of-the-night arrival and the patient he couldn't identify. "Yes," he said finally, in the hall. He and Lena stepped out together, pulling the curtain most of the way behind them, leaving Thornton alone with Harmon for the 15 seconds it took them to position themselves in the corridor. 15 seconds she couldn't avoid and hated. "What do you know about this?" Finch said quietly, not looking at her. "He told me his name when he was briefly conscious," she said. "He told me not to let anyone move him." "Who is he?" She told him. Finch was quiet for 4 full seconds. Then, "You're sure?" He was coherent when he said it. Another pause. "The credentials on those men are formatted wrong," she said. "I don't know who they work for. I do know the transfer didn't come through administration." She watched him absorb this, watched him weigh it against whatever risk calculus a 45-year-old physician in a West Virginia regional hospital applied to a situation like this. She could see the moment the calculation landed. "I'm going to call administration," he said. "Overnight administrator on call." "Yes?" she said. "That's the right call." He moved away down the corridor with his phone already out, and Lena went back into Bay 3. Thornton was standing at the head of the gurney. His right hand was at Harmon's IV line, not adjusting it, holding it. Lena said nothing. She crossed to the monitor on the opposite side of the bed, putting the gurney between them, and began documenting, and kept her peripheral vision on his hands, and calculated that if he introduced something into that line, she had approximately 45 seconds to identify it and respond before it became irreversible. He did not introduce anything. He let go of the IV line. He looked at her across the gurney with the flat attention she'd been on the receiving end of since he'd found her in the lobby, and for the first time since this started, he spoke to her like he was actually speaking to her and not through her. "You don't know what you're involved in," he said. "Probably not," she agreed. "This man has information that—" He stopped. "That what?" He looked at her for another moment. Then he stepped back from the gurney and picked up his phone. The monitor beeped steadily. Harmon's chest rose and fell. Lena documented and waited and counted the minutes, and at minute 16 from Marcus's text, the stairwell door at the end of the corridor opened, and 2 men and a woman in state police uniforms came through it moving fast, and behind them was a man in a dark jacket with a federal credential that was formatted correctly. And when Thornton came out of Bay 3 to meet them, she watched his face do something she hadn't seen it do yet. Uncertainty. The woman in the lead said something to him in a voice too low to carry, and Thornton's 2 colleagues appeared from wherever they'd been positioned, and there was a very quiet, very tense conversation in the corridor outside Bay 3 that lasted approximately 3 minutes and ended with Thornton and his team stepping away from the bay entirely and moving toward the elevator under the loose but unmistakable escort of the state police officers. The man in the dark jacket came to find her. He was 50s, broad through the chest, with the kind of face that had spent years outdoors. He held up his credential long enough for her to read it. Naval Criminal Investigative Service. "You're the nurse who called this in," he said. "Security Supervisor Marcus Tully made the call," she said. "I asked him to." He nodded. "Where's the device?" "With Tully, downstairs security office." "Anyone access it?" "No, and those men—" She gestured toward where Thornton's group had been. "The one named Thornton had his hand on the IV line while I was outside the room." The NCIS agent's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. For how long? 30 seconds, maybe 40. I came back in and he let go. Did the vitals change at all during that window? She pulled up the chart on the mobile terminal without being asked and turned it to show him. He looked at the numbers. He looked at the patient. He looked at her. You recognized the nerve agent, he said. It wasn't a question. I had training. What kind? She held his gaze. The kind I don't discuss in hospital corridors. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Okay. Just that. Okay. He posted one of the state police officers at the bay entrance and went to the nurses' station to make a call, and Lena leaned against the wall beside Bay 3 and let the specific tiredness that came after sustained adrenaline move through her in the way she'd learned to let it move, acknowledging it, not fighting it, staying upright while it passed. Dolores appeared beside her with a cup of coffee. Figured you probably needed this, she said. Lena took it. Thank you. You want to tell me what just happened? Not yet. She wrapped both hands around the cup. Maybe in an hour. Dolores nodded and went back to the station, and Lena watched the NCIS agent through the window of the nurses' station and watched the state officers in the corridor and watched Bay 3's curtain where James Harmon was still unconscious and still breathing and still carrying whatever it was that had been worth poisoning him over. She was still watching when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered, static. Then a voice. Not Thornton, not anyone she'd heard tonight. Older, unhurried. The voice of someone who was not in the building but knew exactly where she was. You bought him a few hours, the voice said. That was smart. But you've got something that doesn't belong to you, and the people you just handed this to are not the people who should have it. She said nothing. The NCIS agent in the corridor, his name is Delgado. He works for someone who wants what's on that drive just as badly as the men you just watched leave. The difference is, Delgado will take longer to show it. Who is this, she said. Someone who served with Harmon for 11 years. A pause. He sent you a message. Protocol 17 November. Do you know what that means? Her heart rate had not changed. She was aware of that. Tell me, she said. It means trust no one in the building, the voice said. It means the only clean channel is a direct line to Pacific Fleet Command, and it means whoever holds that drive right now is the only person he trusts with it. Another pause. He chose you, Nurse Vasquez. Out of every person in that building, he chose you. That tells me something. The line went dead. She stood in the corridor outside Bay 3 with the phone against her ear, and the call already ended, and she looked through the window at Agent Delgado finishing his phone call at the nurses' station, and she looked at the state officers, and she looked at the closed curtain. Marcus had the jacket. Marcus had the drive. And the drive was no longer in the hands of the men she'd managed to stop, which meant it was now in the hands of people who might want it for reasons she didn't understand yet. And a man she'd never met before tonight had told her 30 minutes ago that she was the only person he trusted with it. She pushed off the wall. She had to get back downstairs before anyone else did. She moved fast, but not fast enough to look like she was moving fast, which was a distinction that mattered in a hospital corridor at 2:30 in the morning with a federal agent 20 feet behind her. The stairwell door was at the end of the hall. She pushed through it and took the stairs down at the kind of controlled speed that wouldn't turn an ankle, one hand on the railing, the other at her side, and she was thinking the whole time about what the voice on the phone had said and what it meant if it was true and what it meant if it wasn't. Trust no one in the building. That was either the most important piece of information she'd received tonight, or it was bait designed to make her isolate herself from the one group of people who could actually help her. She didn't know which. The voice had known her name, had known about Protocol 17 November, had claimed a connection to Harmon spanning 11 years, none of which she could verify in the next 60 seconds, which was how long she had before Delgado noticed she wasn't in the corridor anymore. She hit the basement level. The maintenance corridor was dark the way it had been dark before, the overhead fluorescents on their overnight cycle, every third light on at half brightness. She moved toward the security office and pushed through the door without knocking. Marcus looked up from the desk. He had the jacket in front of him and his county radio in his hand, and he was mid-sentence with someone on the other end. She crossed to the desk and held up one hand. "Wait," and he paused his transmission. "The NCIS agent," she said quietly. "Delgado. Do you know anything about him?" Marcus frowned. "He's who my contact called. Harriet vouched for him personally." "Did she know him personally, or did she know of him?" A pause. "She said she'd worked with him 2 years ago. Why?" "I got a call. Unknown number. Someone who says they served with Harmon. They told me Delgado is compromised." Marcus set the radio down. "And you believe them?" "I don't know. Harmon said Protocol 17 November. The caller knew that phrase without me saying it. That could mean they were in the room. The room had me, you, Dolores, Finch, and 2 armed men who just got walked out under state police escort. So either the caller is one of them, or they have access to information that shouldn't be accessible." She looked at the jacket on his desk. "The drive needs to stay here until I know who's clean." "Lena." He said her name the way people said names when they were about to deliver an unwelcome truth. "If Delgado's legit and we're sitting on federal evidence in my supply closet, we're both done." "I know." "And if he's not and we hand it to him, Harmon's dead within the hour." "I know that too." They looked at each other. The radio on his desk crackled, Harriet's voice tinny through the speaker. "Marcus, you go dark on me?" He picked it up. "Still here. Give me 2 minutes." He clicked off transmission and looked at Lena. "What do you need?" "Harriet. What's her direct supervisor? State or federal?" "State. Major Crimes Unit out of Charleston. Not affiliated with NCIS." "Not that I know of." "Okay." She thought for 3 seconds. "Can she run a name?" Quietly, not through the federal system. Just state-level background. "Delgado?" "First name, badge number if she can get it from the credential format, and whatever agency string is on his ID. Marcus clicked back on. "Harriet, I need a quiet background on a federal agent. You able to run that through state channels only?" A pause. "Depends on what you mean by quiet." "Meaning don't share the request with any federal liaison before you call me back." Another pause, longer. "Give me the name." Lena hadn't seen Delgado's first name on the credential. She'd been focused on the agency designation and the format. She held out her hand to Marcus, and he handed her the radio. "This is Vasquez, the nurse who asked Marcus to call you. The agent is Delgado. Badge format was NCIS standard, 6-digit number starting with 4. Late 50s, dark jacket, about 210, 215. He's currently on the 3rd floor of Mercy Hollow General." Harriet's voice was careful when she answered. "Give me 8 minutes." Lena handed the radio back. 8 minutes. She looked at the drive on the desk, and then at Marcus, and then at the door. "I need to go back up," she said. "If I'm gone too long, he'll start looking, and I don't want him looking in the basement." "And the jacket?" She thought about it, thought about the caller's voice, thought about Harmon's grip on her wrist and the specific way he'd said her name, her rank, his own. Coherent, deliberate, prioritized. "Move it," she said. "Not here." Somewhere he'd have no reason to search. Marcus thought for a moment. Then he stood, picked up the jacket, and carried it to the back corner of the security office where a lockable equipment cabinet held the overnight logbooks and the building's master key rack. He folded the jacket inside the cabinet, locked it, and put the key in his front shirt pocket. "Anyone comes in here, that cabinet is maintenance equipment storage," he said. "Good." She went back up. Delgado was where she'd left him, at the nurse's station, but facing the corridor now, and when she came through the stairwell door, he registered her appearance with the kind of neutral attention that meant he'd been tracking how long she'd been gone. "I needed water," she said, before he could ask, and held up the bottle she'd taken from the break room mini-fridge on her way through. He nodded. He didn't believe her. She didn't need him to believe her. She just needed him to have no verifiable reason to press. "We should talk about what happened tonight," he said. "Of course." He gestured toward the family consultation room, the same dark room she'd hidden in 2 hours ago, which felt like a different era. She went in. He followed. He left the door open, which surprised her slightly, and sat in one of the 4 chairs without the energy of a man asserting authority. Just a man who'd been working a long time and was tired but not done. Walk me through it from the beginning, he said. Everything. Don't compress it. She walked him through it. She told him about the arrival, the two men who ran, the presenting symptoms, Finch's initial misdiagnosis, her identification of the cholinergic profile, the atropine and pralidoxime administration, Harmon's brief consciousness, the protocol designation, the 4 suited men. She did not mention the phone call. She did not mention where the jacket was. When she finished, Delgado was quiet for a moment. He said, Protocol 17 November, he said. Yes. And those were the exact words. Yes. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. That's a verification code, not a protocol designation, a code he would have used to authenticate himself to a specific person in a specific network. He looked at her steadily. That network is not NCIS. She kept her face neutral. What network is it? One that Harmon runs independently of his official command. Has for about 6 years. He paused. The men who brought him in tonight aren't random. They were moving him. He was supposed to be transferred to a controlled facility before whatever was administered took full effect. Something went wrong with the timeline. What facility? That I can't tell you yet. Can't or won't? Both, he said, and there was no apology in it, just accuracy. What I can tell you is that the men who presented federal credentials tonight, Thornton's group, they're not rogue actors operating outside the system. They're inside it, deep inside. And whoever sent them knew Harmon's location, which means the transfer plan was compromised before he ever arrived here. Lena thought about that. The 2 men who dropped him off, she said, they ran before anyone could get their names. I know who they are. Are they safe? He paused at that. The pause itself was an answer. We're working on that. She looked at the open door and the corridor beyond it and the state officer visible at the far end of the hall. Is there anything on Harmon's person that the men tonight would have been looking for? Delgado asked. He came in with a jacket, she said. Standard civilian canvas. It went to property storage during treatment. Delgado said, I'll need that. I'll check with intake, she said. Sometimes it takes a while for personal effects to get logged overnight. He looked at her. She looked back. The same 2 people having 2 separate conversations in the same room. His phone buzzed. He stood, glanced at the screen, and his expression shifted by approximately 1 millimeter in a direction she couldn't read. Excuse me? He stepped into the corridor. She sat in the consultation room and waited and counted the seconds. Her phone vibrated. Marcus. She looked at the text under the table. Harriet came back. Delgado clean, state level. But she found a flag. NCIS opened an internal investigation on him 14 months ago. Cleared 8 months ago. Nobody in state system knows details. She read it twice. Cleared didn't mean innocent. It meant the investigation had been closed, which could mean he'd been exonerated, or it could mean someone with enough authority had made the investigation go away. 14 months ago to 8 months ago was a 6-month window that told her nothing useful about what he'd been investigated for. She put the phone away. Delgado came back through the door. I need to move Harmon, he said. The situation is evolving and this hospital is no longer a secure location. He's intubated and critically, I know his status, he said. I've arranged medical transport with appropriate equipment. This isn't optional. Under whose authority? Pacific Fleet Command, he said. The words landed in the specific way words landed when they connected to something already sitting in your mind. Pacific Fleet Command. The caller had said it. Direct line to Pacific Fleet Command. When did you receive that authorization? She said. 20 minutes ago. 20 minutes ago she'd been in the basement. 20 minutes ago she'd received a call from an unknown number telling her Delgado couldn't be trusted. 20 minutes ago she had not yet spoken to Harriet through Marcus's radio. She stood up. I want to see the authorization. Vasquez, in writing, she said. Before I clear a critical intubated patient for transport, I need written authorization from the authorizing command. That's not obstruction. That's my legal responsibility as his nurse of record. He studied her for a long moment. Then he reached into his inside jacket pocket and produced a folded document, printed, official header, a command signature at the bottom. She took it and read it, and it looked correct. The formatting was right. The command designation matched. The signature line had a name she didn't recognize, but a title she did. She handed it back. "I'll prep him for transport," she said. She went to Bay 3. The state officer let her through. She went to Harmon's bedside and stood there for a moment looking at the monitor, the lines, the slow rise and fall of his chest. She pulled her phone. She typed the command designation from the authorization document, not the authorizing officer's name, just the unit designation, and searched it against what she knew. She got nothing useful in 30 seconds and put the phone away because 30 seconds was all she had. She began the transport prep, checking line security, bag placement, vent settings for mobile configuration. Her hands moved through the process automatically while her mind worked the problem from a different angle. The caller had known Protocol 17 November. Delgado's authorization was from Pacific Fleet Command. The caller had told her the only clean channel was a direct line to Pacific Fleet Command. Either the caller was working with Delgado, which made the warning about Delgado a layer of misdirection designed to make her withhold the drive, or the caller was working against Delgado and had deliberately used Pacific Fleet Command as a legitimizing detail to match whatever documentation Delgado would eventually produce. Both were possible. She didn't know which was true. What she knew was that she had about 6 minutes before Delgado's transport team arrived, and Harmon left this building, and once he left this building, she lost any remaining ability to affect what happened to him. She was checking the ventilator connections when Bay 3's curtain moved and Finch came in. He looked at the transport prep she was doing. He looked at her. "You cleared the transfer," he said quietly. "Delgado has Pacific Fleet authorization." "I saw it." A pause. "Vasquez, I made some calls after I talked to you. I have a friend at Bethesda Naval. I described the authorization document I was shown." She went still. "He said Pacific Fleet Command hasn't issued a civilian hospital transfer order in 4 months," Finch said. "Not since they revised the protocol after an incident last year." He watched her face. He said any current transfer order from Pacific Fleet would have a secondary verification code in the bottom margin, a colored seal on the printed copy. She looked at the document in Delgado's pocket, which she no longer had access to. "Was there a colored seal?" Finch said. She thought about the document, the header, the signature, the bottom margin. White. The bottom margin had been white. Finch said nothing else. He didn't have to. She left Bay 3 at a controlled walk and went to the stairwell and called Marcus. "The drive," she said when he picked up. "Don't let it out of that cabinet for anyone. Not the state officers, not Delgado, nobody until I tell you." "What happened?" "The transfer authorization is forged." A beat. "Lena." "I know." She was already moving back up the stairs. "I need you to call Harriet again. Real Pacific Fleet contact, not state liaison. Direct naval line, if she has one. Tell her we have a vice admiral in a West Virginia hospital who came in with a nerve agent in his system, and every person claiming authority to move him tonight has been wrong. She doesn't have a direct naval. Then find someone who does. You have 11 minutes. She came back through the stairwell door onto the 3rd floor, and Delgado was already there, outside Bay 3, with his phone to his ear and an expression that had changed significantly since their conversation in the consultation room. He was looking at her. He lowered the phone. "Where's the drive?" he said. Not the jacket. The drive. He knew. Which meant one of 3 things. The caller had told him, Thornton's team had told him before they'd been walked out, or he'd had access to information about Harmon's cargo before tonight that he hadn't disclosed. She kept walking toward him because stopping would tell him something she didn't want him to know. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "The data module from his vest," Delgado said. "It's not in property storage, I checked." "That's property storage's problem, not mine." "Vasquez." He said her name differently than before. Quieter, more direct. "I understand why you don't trust me. I understand why tonight has made that rational. But if that drive is not in the right hands in the next 30 minutes, 2 of Harmon's team members who are currently in the field are going to be exposed. Their cover is on that drive. Their real identities. And the people who poisoned Harmon tonight are going to cross-reference everything on it before dawn." She looked at him. "How do you know what's on the drive?" she said. "Because I helped build it." The corridor was quiet. The state officer at the far end of it was watching them without approaching. 14 months ago, she said, NCIS opened an internal investigation on you. He didn't flinch. Yes. For what? For unauthorized contact with Harmon's independent network. He met her eyes. Which is exactly what I'm telling you I have now. The investigation was opened by someone inside NCIS who wanted that network shut down. It was closed when the deputy director overrode the inquiry. Because you were cleared. Because the deputy director is the third member of Harmon's network, he said, and she has been for 6 years. 3 seconds of silence. From the far end of the corridor, the state officer's radio burst with static, and then a voice, urgent, clipped, and the officer turned toward the sound and then back, and then he was moving toward them fast. We've got a situation, the officer said as he reached them. Building security just called it in. 2 men accessed the basement level through the loading dock, armed. Delgado's hand went to his jacket. How long ago? 2 minutes? Maybe 3? 2 minutes ago, Lena had been on the phone with Marcus. Marcus, who was alone in the security office in the basement with a locked equipment cabinet and no weapon and a county radio that wasn't going to stop 2 armed men from doing whatever they'd come to do. She moved before anyone told her to. Delgado said something behind her, but she was already at the stairwell door and through it, taking the stairs the way she'd been trained to take stairs in a building with unknown hostiles, fast, close to the wall, listening at each landing before continuing. 2nd floor clear. 1st floor clear. She hit the basement door and paused with her hand on it. Silence from the other side. She pushed through. The maintenance corridor was dark, the same half-lit fluorescence on their overnight cycle, but the security office door at the far end was open. She could see the angle of light across the floor from 20 feet away, and it was wrong. It was coming from somewhere other than the desk lamp, a wider spread of light, the overheads inside. She moved along the wall. 10 feet from the door, she heard Marcus's voice. Not words, just the register and cadence of someone being asked something and trying to answer carefully. Then she heard another voice, lower. Not asking, telling. She reached the doorframe and looked around the edge. Marcus was at his desk. Standing, not sitting. He'd been made to stand. His hands were visible at his sides, and his expression was the controlled blankness of someone managing fear well, but not perfectly. He had a split lip that had not been there 20 minutes ago. One man stood in front of him. The other was at the equipment cabinet in the back corner, working at the lock with something metal. She did not have a weapon. She had the maintenance corridor behind her, which she'd walked twice and knew in the specific embodied way you knew spaces you'd moved through under stress. She had the supply room 3 doors back, which held a cart of equipment she'd noticed on her second pass. She had maybe 90 seconds before the man at the cabinet got the lock open. She went back to the supply room. The cart was there. Industrial, metal-framed, on wheels, loaded with replacement IV equipment in sealed boxes. Heavy. On the shelf below the cart, coiled electrical cable, a replacement fixture box, a battery-operated emergency light. On the hook beside the door, a fire extinguisher. She took the extinguisher. She went back to the corridor. She was 6 feet from the doorframe when the man at the cabinet said, "It's not in here, just books and keys." A pause. Then the man in front of Marcus said, "Where's the jacket?" Marcus said nothing. "Last time," the man said. Lena came through the doorframe. She didn't announce herself. She didn't pause. She crossed the 4 feet between the door and the man standing in front of Marcus and drove the base of the fire extinguisher into the back of his right knee. Not the head, not the spine, the knee, where the ligament collapse would drop him without killing him and without her needing a running start. He went down hard, hitting the desk on his way, knocking the monitor off the edge. She was already moving to the second man who had turned from the cabinet and had his hand going to his side. She pulled the extinguisher pin and discharged it directly into his face. The CO2 hit him at close range. He went backward into the cabinet, hands coming up reflexively to his eyes and face, and she stepped to the side and brought the extinguisher canister down on his wrist, his gun wrist, the one that had been moving toward his waistband. The gun hit the floor. She kicked it under the cabinet. The first man was trying to get up. Marcus was already on him, one hand on the back of his collar, the other arm barring across his throat. The specific technique of someone who had done this before and remembered how. The man's fight went out of him inside 5 seconds. Lena stood with the empty extinguisher and the CO2 dispersing in a white fog around the second man, who was on his knees coughing, eyes streaming. She was breathing hard. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear exactly, from adrenaline processing, the body's honest response to doing something like this. She'd noticed it the first time downrange too. It didn't mean anything except that she was still alive. Marcus looked at her over the first man's head. "You okay?" she said. "My lip's going to be fat," he said. "I know. I'm sorry." He adjusted his grip on the man he was holding. "The cabinet's intact. I watched them try it for 2 minutes and they didn't get through." She looked at the cabinet in the corner, locked. The lock showed scratches from the metal tool, but had held. She went to Marcus's desk and found his zip tie restraints in the second drawer. She'd seen him use them during an ER altercation 6 weeks ago. And she secured both men's wrists behind them and kicked the second man's feet together and zip-tied those too. And she was finishing the second restraint when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Delgado came through the door with the state officer behind him and stopped in the middle of the room, taking in the 2 restrained men, the CO2 residue, Marcus's split lip, and Lena standing in the middle of it with an empty extinguisher in her hand. He looked at her for a long moment. "The drive," he said. She set the extinguisher down. She went to Marcus and held out her hand, and he reached into his shirt pocket and placed the cabinet key in it. She went to the cabinet and unlocked it and removed the jacket and brought it to Delgado. He took it, found the interior panel by touch, quickly, which meant he'd handled one before. He pressed the corner and the panel released, and he looked at the drive, and something in his face changed in a way she didn't have a word for. Not relief. Something older than relief. "Both of them," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Both of what?" she said. He looked up. "There are 2 data modules in this jacket, one in the interior left chest, one sewn into the collar backing." He showed her the collar, a second seam, identical to the first, running along the inside back. Harmon always carries a duplicate, always. The decoy on the left, the real one in the collar. She thought about the men upstairs. Thornton's team, who had arrived looking for the drive, who had come in through the emergency bay and demanded the patient and sent one man scanning for sightlines. If they'd known about the jacket, they'd known about the drive. But had they known about the collar? "The one on the left," she said, "is blank," Delgado confirmed. "Formatted, realistic, completely empty, designed to be found." She thought about the collar, the voice, the warning about Delgado, the mention of Pacific Fleet Command. She thought about the specific intelligence it would take to know the code Protocol 17 November and not know about the caller. Someone with partial access, someone inside the network but not all the way inside. "The call I received earlier tonight," she said. Delgado waited. "Someone called my cell phone. Unknown number. They knew Harmon's protocol code. They told me not to trust you." She watched his face. "They said the only clean channel was Pacific Fleet." Delgado's expression moved. "Did they identify themselves?" "Said they'd served with Harmon for 11 years. He went still. The state officer behind him had his radio out. From upstairs, through the ceiling and the concrete, she could hear, faintly, a change in the ambient sound of the hospital. More voices. Movement. The officer said, "We've got units arriving on the perimeter. Someone called the situation in from outside." Delgado said, "Who called it?" "Dispatch doesn't know. Anonymous." He looked at Lena. She looked at him. They were both thinking the same thing, and she could see it on his face. Whoever had been on the phone with her an hour ago had just called law enforcement to this location, which meant they wanted the building surrounded, which meant they wanted everything that was inside the building to stay inside it, or everything outside the building to stay outside it, or they wanted something moved in the resulting confusion. Delgado's phone rang. He looked at the screen. His face did something she hadn't seen it do yet, something involuntary, something that happened before his professional training could catch up with his reaction. He showed her the screen. The incoming number was Harmon's name. Harmon, who was intubated and unconscious 3 floors above them. Someone was calling from Harmon's phone. Delgado answered it on the second ring. He didn't put it on speaker. He held it to his ear and listened, and Lena watched his face the way she watched monitors, Not for the numbers themselves, but for the moment the numbers changed. His expression stayed controlled for the first 4 seconds, and then something moved through it, fast and involuntary, and he turned slightly away from her and the state officer and Marcus. "How long ago?" he said. Then, "Don't move him. Don't let anyone in that room." He ended the call. He looked at Lena. "Harmon's awake," he said. She was already moving toward the door. Delgado caught her arm. Not hard, not aggressive, just enough to stop her forward momentum. The call came from his room phone. He's been conscious for approximately 6 minutes. The officer upstairs said he pulled out his own intubation tube. She processed that. Self-extubation was dangerous under any circumstances and deeply alarming in a patient who'd presented with cholinergic toxidrome 2 hours ago. Either his recovery was faster than anything she'd seen with this class of agent, or the original exposure had been calculated, a dose large enough to incapacitate but not to cause the full progression she'd been treating against. "He needs to be assessed immediately," she said. "I know, but he's also talking, and what he's saying is why I needed you to hear this." Delgado looked at the state officer, then back at her. "The man who called your cell phone tonight. Harmon says he knows who it was." The fluorescence hummed overhead. One of the 2 restrained men on the floor shifted, and Marcus put a hand on his shoulder, not roughly. "Then we need to go upstairs," Lena said. Delgado released her arm. They took the stairs. The state officer stayed in the basement with the 2 restrained men and his radio and instructions to let no one in or out of the loading dock. As they climbed, Delgado said quietly, "Whatever Harmon tells you up there, I need you to stay calm, and I need you to let me manage the response. There are people in this building right now who are waiting to see which direction this breaks." "Thornton's group was walked out," she said. "Thornton's group was the visible layer," he said. "I said there are people in this building." She didn't say anything else until they reached the 3rd floor. The state officer outside Bay 3 had been replaced by 2. One she recognized from earlier, one she didn't. Delgado showed his credential, and they moved aside. She pushed through the curtain. Harmon was sitting up. Not all the way. The head of the gurney was elevated about 40 degrees, and he was leaning against it rather than sitting independently, and he was pale in the way people were pale after their body had been running on emergency reserves for hours. The extubation tube was out. The monitor showed his heart rate at 61, which was low normal for someone conditioned and recovering. He'd pulled his own IV line too. She could see the bruising already forming on the back of his hand where the catheter had been, a small bloom of dark red under the skin. He looked at her when she came in. Not the way he'd looked at her in those 30 seconds of consciousness 2 hours ago, unfocused, finding her by proximity. He looked at her with full attention, the kind of attention that had been rebuilt from somewhere very quiet and was now back at full operational capacity, which was frankly alarming given what his tox panel had shown. "You're the one who treated me," he said. His voice was rough from the tube. "Yes." "What did you use?" "Atropine and pralidoxime. Time to the acetylcholine progression. You had about 4 minutes before seizure onset." He looked at her for another moment. "What's your background?" "Army medic. Combat deployed." A small nod, like something he'd already suspected had been confirmed. He looked at Delgado. "The drive." Delgado produced the jacket. Harmon reached out and ran his hand along the collar seam without being told where to look, finding the 2nd module by muscle memory. He pressed the corner. It released. He held the drive in his palm for a moment, then closed his fingers around it. "The call," he said. "Someone called this nurse." "She told me," Delgado said. "We think it was Reyes." Harmon closed his eyes for 2 seconds. When he opened them, they were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the nerve agent. It was Reyes. "He knew the protocol code," Lena said. "He was present when I developed it," Harmon said. 6 years ago. He was the 3rd person in that room. The other 2 were Delgado and Deputy Director Wainwright. He looked at Delgado. "How much did he tell her?" "Enough to establish credibility. Said he'd served with you 11 years, told her to trust Pacific Fleet over NCIS, warned her about Delgado specifically." "He would warn her about Delgado." Harmon shifted against the inclined gurney and winced. His shoulder, she noticed, the left one, a separate injury she hadn't assessed yet. Adrian Reyes has been running counterintelligence for the group that poisoned me for approximately 14 months, since before the NCIS investigation into Delgado that he helped initiate. The room was very quiet. He was inside your network, Lena said. He was inside everything, Harmon said. He helped build it, and then he sold access to an organization called Meridian Group, private intelligence contractor, 12-country operation, and the people who put whatever was in my system tonight. He shifted again, and this time she stepped forward and adjusted the gurney without asking, because the shoulder pain was going to work against coherent conversation, and he couldn't afford incoherence right now. He looked up at her when she did it, didn't thank her, just continued. The drive has 19 months of documentation. Meridian Group's domestic operations, the penetration of 3 federal agencies, 6 active field operatives whose covers were manufactured using classified naval identity files. Where are they now? Delgado said. The 6. 3 I know. 3 Reyes knows. Harmon's jaw tightened. Which is why this needs to go to Wainwright's desk in the next 2 hours. Not NCIS Maine, not Pacific Fleet Chain. Direct to Wainwright, encrypted. I can do that from my field kit, Delgado said. I need 20 minutes and a secure room. Lena was checking Harmon's shoulder with 2 fingers, feeling along the joint. He tensed, but didn't pull away. This is older than tonight, she said. 3 weeks old, he said. It's not fully healed. Whatever you're planning to do in the next 2 hours, this arm is not going to help you do it. I'm aware. I'm telling you because if you dislocate it in the middle of something that requires both hands, you'll be done. He looked at her with the expression of someone who had been given practical information by a subordinate and was deciding whether to be annoyed by it or grateful for it. He landed somewhere between. Noted. Delgado was already on his phone, speaking quietly at the edge of the room. Lena went to the supply drawer at the side of the bay and found an elastic wrap and came back and began supporting the shoulder properly. Not a sling, which would announce injury and limit his options, but a wrap that would hold the joint through moderate exertion. He let her work without comment. The man who called me, she said, keeping her voice low. Reyes. He told me not to let anyone in this building have the drive. Including him, presumably, Harmon said. He'd have presented himself as a rescue option somewhere in the next hour. Someone you could hand it to who wasn't Delgado, wasn't Thornton, wasn't anyone you'd already identified as compromised. He watched her hands working the wrap. He's good at that. Finding the person in the room who's trying to do the right thing and giving them a version of events where he's the right answer. He almost worked, she said. I know. There was something in his voice that wasn't quite guilt, but was adjacent to it. I'm sorry he was in your phone. She tied off the wrap. How did he know my number? He has access to hospital staff databases. Has for about 8 months. He paused. He knew I'd be brought here because he was the one who changed the transfer routing. The original plan had me at a naval medical facility in Maryland. He rerouted the 2 men carrying me to this hospital and then sent Thornton's group to arrive before any legitimate backup could. He wanted the drive. He wanted to know what was on it before Wainwright did. Once he knew, he could decide whether to suppress it or use it. Harmon looked down at the drive, still closed in his fist. He didn't count on the transfer going wrong. The men who were moving me panicked when I started presenting symptoms. The dosage was miscalculated. It hit faster than Reyes told them it would, so they dropped me here instead of waiting for the controlled handoff. The monitor beeped steadily. His color was better than 15 minutes ago, still pale, but returning. You need a new IV, she said. Later. Your fluid balance? Later, he said, and the word was quiet but final, and she let it go because she understood the hierarchy of what needed to happen in the next 2 hours, and hydration was genuinely not the top item. Delgado came back from the edge of the room. Wainwright's been reached. She's activating a secure relay through NSA East. We need a hard line. The hospital's administrative network won't work. I need something outside the facility's main system. Marcus has a county emergency line in the basement, Lena said. Separate infrastructure, not routed through the hospital. Will he let me use it? Yes. She looked at Harmon. Can he be moved down there? Harmon was already pulling the monitor leads off his chest. She almost stopped him and then didn't because the monitor leads were not going to save him, and the next 2 hours might. Getting Harmon down 2 flights of stairs in his current state was not a smooth operation. She took his right side, keeping his left shoulder from bearing weight, and Delgado took his left with a careful awareness of the wrapped joint, and they moved through the back corridor to the stairwell. The state officers offered to assist. Harmon declined with a look that didn't require words. He made the stairs slowly. She could feel the effort it cost him in the way his right hand gripped the railing, the specific whitening of the knuckles that meant he was putting more into staying vertical than he was comfortable admitting. But he made them. Marcus's face when they came through the security office door was an education in suppressed reaction. He took one look at Harmon, the gray pallor, the wrapped shoulder, the bare arm with the bruise blooming from the pulled IV, and then looked at Lena with an expression that said a great deal about his opinion of whatever she'd been doing for the last 40 minutes. "He needs the county line," she said. Marcus was already moving the chair. Delgado sat up at the desk with a field kit, a hardened tablet, and an encryption dongle that he connected to Marcus's landline port with an adapter he'd had in his jacket pocket. The setup took 9 minutes. Lena used the time to get Harmon into the chair and find a blood pressure cuff from the supply room and check his vitals manually since he was no longer on a monitor. 90/62. Low, but not critically. His pulse was steady at 58. "Drink this," she said, handing him a bottle of water from Marcus's mini fridge. He drank it without arguing, which told her more about his current state than the blood pressure had. Delgado finished the connection and transmitted. The process took 11 minutes and consisted entirely of him typing at the tablet with the focused silence of someone performing a technical task that required precision. When he finished, he sat back and said, "It's through. Wainwright has the drive data." Harmon exhaled. "Just once, just slightly. The specific release of someone who has been carrying a weight for a very long time and has just set it down somewhere it can be someone else's problem." Then he said, "Where's Reyes now?" "Unknown," Delgado said. "He's not in the building, or we'd have—" "He's in the building," Harmon said. Silence. "He called this nurse from my room phone, Harmon said. "He told her the right things. He watched Thornton's group get walked out, and he knew the drive hadn't left the building because if it had, Thornton would have confirmed it before the state police arrived." He looked at the door. "He's been waiting. Not for the drive. He knows the drive is gone now. He's waiting for something else." "What?" Delgado said. Harmon looked at Lena. The look lasted long enough that she understood it was an answer. "He called me," she said slowly. "Specifically, a nurse he'd identified from hospital records. Someone he assessed as the right person to manipulate into isolating the drive from legitimate authority." She thought about the voice, unhurried, calibrated. The voice of someone who had spent years identifying the right person in a room and giving them the right version of events. He needed the drive. He doesn't have it. The next best thing is the person who held it. "Witnesses can be managed," Harmon said, not without weight. Delgado was already on his feet and at the door. "Marcus?" Lena said. Marcus straightened from the corner where he'd been standing out of the way. "Yeah." "Is there a second way out of this basement?" "Loading dock, which we've got covered, maintenance tunnel that runs under the north parking structure, comes up in the utility building by the road." "Who knows about it?" "Anyone who's spent time down here. It's on the building schematics." But the building schematics, she thought, that Adrian Reyes had likely accessed along with the staff database 8 months ago. She said, "The tunnel. Can you lock the exit from this end?" "There's a bolt on the tunnel door." "Lock it." He moved. She heard the scrape of the bolt a moment later from somewhere behind the equipment cabinet. Delgado was in the corridor outside the security office, speaking into his radio in a voice she couldn't hear clearly. She went to the doorframe and looked out. The maintenance corridor stretched the length of the basement, doors on either side, the stairwell at the far end. At the near end, the loading dock access door, closed. The state officer visible through its small wire mesh window. The corridor appeared clear. She looked at Harmon. He was watching her from the chair, and he was doing the thing she'd noticed from the moment he woke up, tracking the room with the peripheral attention of someone who processed threat data as a background function, the way other people processed weather. "He's not going to come through the corridor," he said. "No," she agreed. "He doesn't operate that way. He works through intermediaries and he works through information. If he's still here, there's a reason he hasn't left." She looked at the restrained men against the far wall. The one with the heavy jaw had been quiet since she'd zip-tied him. The other one, the one she'd hit with the extinguisher base, had been favoring his right knee and was likely going to need that looked at, but she was not going to look at it right now. She went over to the heavy-jawed man. She crouched down in front of him. He looked at her. He had the face of someone who had been trained to give nothing away and was implementing that training effectively, which itself told her something. "Thornton's team was 4 people," she said. "You're 2. You came in through the loading dock after Thornton left, which means you're not Thornton's operation." He said nothing. "You're Reyes," she said. Something moved in his face. Fractional, involuntary. "Enough. He sent you for the drive and you didn't get it," she said. "So what's the secondary objective?" "Nothing." She stood up. She looked at Delgado in the doorway. "Do you have a photograph of Reyes?" He pulled out his phone and brought up a file. He showed her the screen. The man in the photograph was in his mid-50s, lean, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and the kind of face that was immediately forgettable in the best possible way. Not distinctive, not unusual, the face of someone who had built a career on being underestimated. She recognized him. Not from anywhere in her past, from 40 minutes ago, from the corridor on the second floor where she'd been walking from the family consultation room and had passed 2 people going the opposite direction and had clocked them as staff without looking closely because the late hour and the suit she'd been trying to avoid had been monopolizing her attention. He had been wearing scrubs, not the consultation room man, not the sightline scanner, a different person, separate from Thornton's group entirely, who had been in the corridor of the second floor 40 minutes ago in borrowed scrubs, walking in the direction of the stairwell she'd just come from. "He's upstairs," she said. Delgado's radio was already at his mouth. She was already past him. Not running, but close. The fast-controlled movement she'd defaulted to all night. The one that looked like urgency but preserved enough caution to keep her from walking into something she couldn't see. The stairwell. First floor, second floor. She came out into the second-floor corridor. The state officer who had been posted here earlier was on the ground. Not dead. She could see the chest movement from 8 feet away. The slow rhythm of someone unconscious rather than the stillness of something worse. But down, with a taser prong visible on the back of his collar, which meant someone had hit him from behind and from close range. She moved past him to the stairwell door to the 3rd floor and pushed through. The 3rd floor corridor was wrong before she could identify specifically how, a texture to the quiet that was different from the managed quiet of the last hour. The 2 state officers who had been outside Bay 3 were both present, both upright, and between them, in the open doorway of Bay 3, stood a man in green scrubs. He was facing away from her. He had a phone to his ear and one hand resting on the curtain rod of Bay 3's entrance, and he was speaking quietly into the phone with the specific unhurried cadence she recognized from her own phone call 2 hours ago. "It's already transmitted," he said into the phone. "I'm telling you it's done. We move to phase 2. A pause. "The nurse is a loose end. Delgado is a manageable problem. Harmon," one of the state officers said. "Sir." The man turned. Adrian Reyes looked at Lena from 15 feet away, and for 1 second the calibration failed. She could see it happen. The slight displacement of a man who had constructed an extremely detailed version of events in which this particular person was in the basement with the drive and the NCIS agent and nowhere near the 3rd floor at this particular moment. Then the calibration came back. He lowered the phone. "Nurse Vasquez," he said. He had the kind of voice that was practiced at being the most reasonable sound in a room. "I was just coming to find you. There's been a development." "Step away from the bay," she said. The state officers were looking between them. "I understand you've had a very difficult night," Reyes said, and his voice had the specific warm concern of someone who had been doing this for 20 years. I want to help you understand what's actually happening here, because I'm afraid Delgado has given you a version of events that isn't. The officer in the corridor below has a taser prong in his collar, she said. A pause. I found him that way, Reyes said. Step away from the bay. He looked at the two state officers. She could see the calculation happening. Which one he thought he could work. What version of events would best serve the next 30 seconds? How much time he had before Delgado reached the third floor. She's experiencing a stressful night, he said to the officers, with a kind of careful sadness that was genuinely impressive. She's been involved in a situation that's clearly affected her judgment. I'm a federal. He tased your colleague downstairs, Lena said to the officers. He's not federal. He's Adrian Reyes. He's the subject of a current investigation by Deputy Director Wainwright of NCIS, and he's been in this hospital for the last 40 minutes in stolen scrubs. The officers looked at each other. Reyes's phone was still in his hand. His thumb moved. Don't send that, she said. His thumb moved anyway. She didn't know what he'd sent or to whom. She knew it mattered. She crossed the distance between them in 4 steps. Not running, no running in a hospital corridor with linoleum that was still slightly wet from the overnight mopping, and she held out her hand. Give me the phone. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He was still doing the calculation, and she could see the moment he arrived at the answer, which was that there was no version of the next 30 seconds where the phone helped him. He handed it to her. The state officers had their hands on his arms before he'd fully extended the gesture. Delgado came through the stairwell door 40 seconds later, breathing harder than usual from the stairs, with Marcus's county radio in his hand and 2 additional officers behind him. He took one look at the scene in the corridor. Reyes secured between the 2 state officers, Lena standing with the phone, Bay 3's curtain intact. And he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, Is Harmon— I didn't touch him, Reyes said. His voice had lost the warmth but not the control. Whatever you think you have on me, it's not enough for— We have 19 months of documentation and a direct transmission to Deputy Director Wainwright that went through 40 minutes ago, Delgado said. We have 2 of your people restrained in the basement. We have a tased state police officer on the floor below us. He looked at the officers holding Reyes. Take him. They moved. Reyes went without resistance, which was its own kind of information. The decision of someone who understood that resistance here served nothing, and that the next fight would be in a different arena where he had more tools. She watched them take him toward the elevator and thought about what he'd said on the phone before she'd come through the stairwell door. The nurse is a loose end. She looked at the phone in her hand. The last sent message was a 6-digit number. Just that. No recipient name visible. The contact listed only as a string of letters that meant nothing to her. She handed the phone to Delgado without comment. He looked at the message. His jaw tightened. What is that? She said. A location code, he said. There are people in the field tonight who don't know any of this has happened. He was already typing with his thumb. I need to reach Wainwright. She left him to it. She went into Bay 3. Harmon was not there. The gurney was empty. The monitor was off. The curtain was pulled halfway back and the room was exactly as it had been, except that the person who was supposed to be in it was not. She looked at the corridor. The state officers, Delgado, the receding sounds of Reyes being moved to the elevator. She looked at the supply corridor access door at the far end of Bay 3 that connected to the medical gas storage room in the back hallway. It was 6 inches open. She pushed through it. Harmon was in the back hallway. Standing, which he should not have been. His left arm was held carefully against his side, and he was leaning against the wall with his right hand flat on the surface, and he had the focused stillness of someone who had left a room for a specific reason and had not yet accomplished it. What are you doing? She said. I heard his voice, he said. In the corridor. He's being taken down now. It's handled. He looked at her. His face in the dimmer light of the back hallway was unreadable in a different way than Delgado's had been. Not trained control, but something that went deeper than control. 11 years, the caller had said. Harmon had spent 11 years building a network, and Adrian Reyes had been inside it, and she understood now that what was on his face wasn't anger and wasn't vindication. It was something more complicated than either. The message he sent, Harmon said. Did you see it? 6-digit code. Delgado's trying to reach Wainwright. It's not a location. He pushed off the wall. He was steadier than he should have been. It's an abort. He sent an abort code to whoever is running the field end of tonight's operation. His eyes found hers in the dim light. Which means the 3 operatives whose covers I don't know about, the 3 Reyes knew. They're being pulled out right now, before any of this reaches them. She stood in the back hallway of the 3rd floor of Mercy Hollow General at 4 in the morning and looked at a vice admiral who had been poisoned with a nerve agent 6 hours ago and was standing upright through what she could only describe as will, and she understood what he was saying. The drive had everything, except the 3 names Reyes had kept only in his own head. And Reyes, who was now in custody and who understood exactly how much trouble he was in, had just made certain those 3 names left with him. She said, "He's not going to give you those names." "No," Harmon said, "he's not." "So what do you do?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who didn't have an answer. The quiet of someone who had been carrying the answer for a long time and was deciding whether the next person he said it to was the right person. He looked at her in the dim hallway, and something settled in his expression. "I had a list," he said, "before Reyes, before any of this. 19 months ago, when I started building the documentation, I ran a parallel track, a behavioral analysis of everyone inside the network, looking for the inconsistencies that show up when someone is feeding information in 2 directions at once." He shifted his weight off the wall slightly, and his face tightened from the shoulder. "I narrowed it to 11 people. Reyes helped me narrow it further. He told me which 7 were clean." She understood immediately. "Which means the 4 he told you to eliminate from the list are the ones he was protecting." He looked at her. "I know 3 of the 4. I've known for about 6 weeks. The 4th is the one I haven't been able to confirm, which is why the drive matters. Not because the names are on it, but because the financial routing is. And financial routing, with the right analyst, gives you the 4th name inside 48 hours. Does Wainwright know this? She knows about the 3. The 4th is what I was bringing her when Reyes changed my route." She absorbed this. In the corridor beyond Bay 3, she could hear Delgado on the radio, his voice low and urgent, the specific cadence of someone managing multiple threads at once. She looked at Harmon's left shoulder. The wrap she'd put on it in Bay 3 was still holding, but she could see the tension in the way he held the joint, the millimeter of elevation that meant the pain was sitting at a level he was actively managing. "You need to sit down," she said. "I've been sitting down for 4 hours." "You've been unconscious for 4 hours. That's not the same thing." He almost smiled. "Not quite." "Is there a difference medically?" "Yes. Your blood pressure is 90/62 and you pulled your own IV, so the only thing keeping you functional right now is whatever your body's been running on for the last 20 years, and that has a limit." He looked at her for a moment. Then he walked back through the supply corridor door into Bay 3, which she chose to read as compliance. She followed him and found a fresh IV kit and got a line back in his right arm. He watched the process with the same detached attention he'd applied to everything, which she recognized as a coping mechanism rather than indifference. And she started a saline drip and hung the bag on the IV stand beside the gurney and looked at him. "Sit on the gurney," she said. "You don't have to lie down." He sat. The monitor was still off. She left it off because reconnecting it would bring someone from the nurse's station, and she wasn't ready for the conversation that would follow. She checked his pulse manually. 61. Steadier. Delgado came through the curtain. He looked at the IV. He looked at Harmon on the gurney. He said, "Wainwright's team is moving. She had the financial routing analyzed before I finished the transmission. She had a separate team standing by." Harmon said, "The 4th name." "She has it." Delgado said it quietly. "She's had it for 11 days. She was waiting for the drive to confirm before moving." The hallway outside was audible. Voices, movement, the organized sounds of a situation being managed by people who knew how to manage it. Through the exterior window of the bay, the first gray of early morning was beginning to separate the sky from the tree line, barely, just the suggestion of it. "Then it's done," Harmon said. "The arrests are being coordinated for 6 a.m., all 4 simultaneously, domestic and 1 foreign national through Interpol liaison." Delgado paused. "Reyes is already talking." "Of course he is," Harmon said. Not bitterly, just accurately. He gave up the abort code recipient inside 40 minutes. Wainwright's team intercepted 2 of the 3 field operatives before they could move. Third is still active but contained. He doesn't know we have him yet. Delgado looked at the floor briefly, then back up. It worked. All of it. The drive, the routing, tonight? It worked. Harmon nodded once. He didn't look triumphant. He looked like a man who had completed something that had cost him significantly and was now trying to determine whether the cost was something he could reconcile later or something he was going to carry for a long time. He looked at Lena. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Okay?" "When Reyes called you, when he told you not to trust Delgado, gave you the right codes, built the right version of events, you had no way to verify any of it. You had a drive you couldn't open, a patient you didn't know, and a federal agent with a flag on his record." He held her gaze. "Why didn't you give it to him?" She thought about the honest answer, which was not simple. "Because the way he framed things was too complete," she said. "Every question had an answer. Every concern had a preemptive explanation. Real situations have gaps. Real people asking for your trust show you the gaps." She paused. "And because you told me the one thing that mattered, you woke up for 30 seconds and you used them to tell me not to let anyone take you. You didn't tell me who to trust. You told me what to protect. That's a different instruction." He was quiet. "I've been given orders by people who had all the right credentials and all the wrong intentions," she said. "I've been given instructions by people with no credentials at all, who were the only honest voice in the room. After a while, you stop tracking the credentials and start tracking what someone's actually asking you to do." Harmon looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face now that hadn't been there before. Not gratitude exactly, but a kind of recognition that she understood. Because she'd felt it herself sometimes. The particular experience of being seen accurately by someone who had no reason to look that carefully. "What did they tell you when you left the army?" he said. She didn't answer immediately. "That I was a good medic. That my skills would transfer well to civilian medicine." "Did they tell you why your unit's mission classification was elevated after your second tour?" She went still. "I had your file pulled 6 weeks ago," he said. "When I was building the behavioral profiles of my network, I ran cross-references on everyone Reyes had been in contact with over the past 2 years. Your name came up because he accessed your hospital employment records. That's how I know what I know." He shifted on the gurney. "Your classification was elevated because of what you did in the Kerala Valley. The combat medic assessment noted that you maintained treatment protocol on 4 casualties simultaneously while under direct fire for 11 minutes. It also noted that you identified a compound fracture in a patient who was presenting with head trauma symptoms. The attending trauma surgeon at Bagram had initially missed it." She said nothing. "You were 23, he said. 24, she said. "You were 24 years old and you caught something a trauma surgeon missed and kept 4 people alive under active fire." He looked at her steadily. "And then you came home and you took a nursing job at a regional hospital in West Virginia because, what? The job posting matched your location preference?" She looked at the window. The gray outside had deepened by a degree. "Because I needed something that wasn't the other thing." He nodded. Like he understood exactly what the other thing was. "I'm not going to tell you what to do with the rest of your career," he said. "I've already taken enough of your night." He glanced at Delgado. "But I want you to know that what you did tonight, the atropine timing, the recognition, the drive, the decision-making under sustained ambiguity, that is not standard nursing care. That is not even standard military medicine. That is a specific and rare combination of technical skill and situational judgment that most people never develop regardless of how much training they receive." "I had good training," she said. "So did 30,000 other people," he said. You're not hearing me." She heard him. She just didn't have a response that wasn't either false modesty or an agreement that felt presumptuous, so she said nothing, and he seemed to accept that as a reasonable answer. Delgado said quietly from the edge of the room, "The state police are going to need statements from both of you before 6. And the hospital administrator is in the building. She was called in around 4. She's going to have questions." "What kind of questions?" Lena said. "The kind an administrator asks when her hospital has been the site of a federal operation. 2 armed men were restrained in the basement. A state officer was tased on the second floor, and her overnight physician is currently in the attending lounge refusing to come out. Delgado almost smiled. It didn't quite get there. Nothing that's going to be bad for you. What you did tonight is going to be very clearly documented. She thought about Finch, about the authorization document he'd refused to sign without a proper destination, about the priority 2 page that had brought him to Bay 3 in time to put a procedural obstacle between Thornton and Harmon. Finch bought time tonight too, she said. He wouldn't sign the transfer release. I know, Delgado said. His statement's already been recorded. She left Bay 3 for the first time in 20 minutes and walked down the corridor to the attending lounge at the far end. She knocked. A pause. Then Finch's voice. Come in. He was sitting at the small table in the center of the room with a cup of coffee that had clearly gone cold and an expression that had gone through several iterations since she'd last seen him. He looked up when she came in, and what was on his face now was something she hadn't expected, which was a kind of exhausted candor. Is he alive? Finch said. Yes. Stable IV fluids. Blood pressure improving. He nodded. He looked at the cold coffee. I've been sitting here trying to figure out when I stopped listening to the nurses. She sat down across from him. It was a small table. You listened tonight, she said. Eventually. He turned the cup on its base. You told me his vitals were wrong from the beginning. You told me the presentation didn't match. I dismissed it because... He stopped. Because I was new and young and you had more credentials, she said. Not angrily, just as a fact. Yes. He said it without dressing it up, which she respected. I've been a doctor for 17 years, and I have dismissed... I don't know how many concerns from nurses who turned out to be right, because the instinct calcifies. You stop updating the assessment after a certain number of years because the assessment is usually correct, and the interruptions are usually noise. He looked at her. Tonight, you were not noise. Tonight I had specific prior training that made the presentation legible, she said. It wasn't instinct. I knew what I was looking at. You knew, and you said so, and I overrode you. He met her eyes. That man would be dead. She didn't confirm or deny it, because it was true, and saying so wouldn't help anything. The administrator is going to ask what happened in that bay, she said. I'd appreciate it if the record reflected the treatment sequence accurately. It will, he said. I already made sure of it. She left him with his cold coffee and went back to the nurse's station. Dolores was still there. Of course she was. Dolores had been on the same shift and apparently intended to see it through to its conclusion. She handed Lena a fresh cup of coffee when she got to the station, and the coffee was hot, and Lena stood at the counter and drank half of it without speaking, and Dolores let her, which was another thing she appreciated about Dolores. You want to tell me now? Dolores said. Lena told her. Not everything. The classified elements she omitted and Dolores didn't push, but enough that the shape of the night became coherent. When she finished, Dolores was quiet for a moment. The naloxone, she said, when Finch ordered it. It wasn't going to work. You knew immediately. I knew as soon as I checked the muscle response. Dolores looked at her. I've been a nurse for 22 years, she said. I've worked with a lot of people. I've worked with people who were technically very good and instinctively very good, and occasionally both at the same time. She paused. You're the third kind. I figured that out about 6 weeks in. You just never made a point of it. Making a point of it doesn't help patients, Lena said. No, Dolores agreed. It doesn't. But not making a point of it also means people like Finch get to keep dismissing you. She picked up her own coffee. There's a version of tonight that goes differently if he'd listened to you in the first 30 seconds. Lena thought about that. There's a version of tonight that goes differently if the 2 men who dropped him off hadn't panicked and brought him here instead of wherever they were originally headed, she said. There are a lot of versions. In this one, everyone who mattered lived. Dolores nodded. She accepted that the way pragmatic people accepted things, not because it resolved the frustration, but because the frustration was less useful than the fact. The administrator arrived at the nurse's station at 5:40. Her name was Patricia Osei. and she was a 60-year-old Ghanaian-American woman who had been running Mercy Hollow General for 9 years, and who had arrived at 4 in the morning in a pressed blazer, and with the specific focused calm of someone who had managed crises before and had strong opinions about how they should be managed. She introduced herself to Lena with a firm handshake and looked at her for a long moment. "You're the nurse who initiated treatment," she said. "Yes." "Against the attending's initial order." "Yes." Osei nodded slowly. "I've been briefed by Agent Delgado and I've read the preliminary treatment notes. I want to hear it from you." Lena told her. The full clinical version, the presentation, the recognition, the decision to administer without authorization, the reasoning behind each step. Osei listened without interrupting and without writing anything down, which meant she was going to remember it exactly as said, which Lena found clarifying in the way that clarity was sometimes uncomfortable. When she finished, Osei said, "You violated the attending's explicit instruction." "Yes." "And the patient survived as a direct result." "Yes." "And you'd do it again?" Lena looked at her. "If the clinical picture was the same, yes." Osei was quiet for 2 seconds. "Good," she said. "That's the correct answer. The incorrect answer would have been to hedge it." She made a note on the tablet she carried. "You'll be asked to document your reasoning in full for the incident review. That documentation will also be submitted to the State Nursing Board as a supporting record for the treatment decision. Given the outcome and the circumstances, I don't anticipate any adverse finding." I'm not worried about the nursing board," Lena said. Osei looked at her. "What are you worried about?" She thought about it honestly. "The 3 field operatives," she said, "the ones whose covers were on the drive. Delgado said 2 were intercepted. One's contained but not finished." She looked down the corridor toward Bay 3. "Harmon's people. They're still out there doing whatever it is they do, and one of them is still in a situation that isn't resolved." Osei was quiet for a moment. "That's not a nursing concern," she said, not dismissively, accurately. "I know," Lena said. "I'm still worried about it." She went back to Bay 3 at 6:15 to check Harmon's fluids and found Delgado there, standing at the foot of the gurney, and Harmon upright against the elevated head with the IV drip at the last quarter of the bag, and color genuinely returning to his face for the first time since he'd arrived. Delgado said, "The 3rd operative was brought in 20 minutes ago, safe." She hung the replacement fluid bag before she said anything else. "All 3, she said. "All 3. She looked at Harmon. He was looking at the window, where the gray had become actual morning now. Pale yellow at the horizon, the parking lot outside taking on shape and dimension. His expression was doing the thing again, the complicated thing she didn't have a word for, and she understood it better now than she had in the hallway. 11 years. A network he'd built. A man he'd trusted for more than a decade, who had sold access to people willing to use nerve agents in West Virginia parking garages. The 3 names resolved and the 3 people safe didn't cancel any of that out. It just meant the accounting could eventually close, which was a different thing. The arrest went at 6 a.m., Delgado said. Simultaneous, domestic. Reyes's 4 contacts. 1 was a congressional liaison. That's going to be public by noon. Meridian Group, Harmon said. Their domestic operation is finished. International will take longer, but Wainwright has Interpol coordinating and the financial documentation is comprehensive. Delgado paused. It's over. The part that was yours to finish, it's done. Harmon said nothing for a moment. Then he said, The men who dropped me off, are they? Safe, Delgado said. Both. They went to ground at a secondary location when the transfer went wrong and stayed there. They're being debriefed now. Harmon nodded. He looked at Lena. I owe you more than I'm able to say in this room, he said. She considered deflecting it and decided not to because it was true and he knew it was true. And deflecting genuine things was a habit she'd developed as a way of making herself smaller in rooms where she'd needed to be small, and she was very tired of needing to be small. You don't owe me anything, she said. You paid for it in advance. You woke up for 30 seconds and you used them well. He looked at her. What you did with those 30 seconds is what I'm talking about. I know. They looked at each other, and in the specific vocabulary of people who had both operated in situations where 30 seconds was the difference between outcomes, that was a complete conversation. Delgado stepped out to take a call. In the quiet that followed, she replaced Harmon's IV cath tape. It had loosened, and checked the drip rate and looked at his blood pressure with the cuff and noted that it was now 104/71, which was still not good, but was meaningfully better than 90/62, and she wrote it in the chart she'd kept maintaining through everything because the chart was the record and the record mattered. "The fourth name," she said, not looking up from the chart. "The one Wainwright identified. Was it someone Reyes told you was clean?" "Yes," Harmon said. "How long have you known Reyes?" 16 years. She wrote down the blood pressure. She clipped the chart back. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her. 16 years is a long time to be wrong about someone, she said. "I'm not saying it dismissively. I mean it." He was quiet. "You think I should have caught it earlier. I think it doesn't matter whether you should have. You didn't, and that's human, and the people you were trying to protect are safe." She looked at him. "Being wrong about someone you trusted for 16 years is not a failure of intelligence. It's a failure of their character. There's a difference." He was looking at her with the same quality of attention he'd applied to everything. Full, unhurried, calibrated. "You sound like you've thought about that before." "I've had reasons to." He didn't push it, and she was grateful for that. At 7:30, Patricia Osei came to Bay 3 to inform Harmon that a naval medical team had been dispatched from Bethesda and would arrive at Mercy Hollow General by 10 a.m. to manage his ongoing care and transfer. She delivered this information with the professional efficiency of someone who had spent the last 3 hours managing the administrative consequences of a federal operation in her hospital and was handling it without visible distress, which Lena thought said a great deal about her. After Osei left, Harmon looked at Lena and said, "When the Bethesda team arrives, you're off the case." "I know. You should sleep." "I have 2 hours left on my shift." He looked at her. "I think the administrator might make an exception." "She might. I'm not going to ask." He almost smiled again. This time it got slightly further. "No, I didn't think you would." She finished her shift at 8 a.m. She charted everything, including the items that were uncomfortable to chart. The deviation from the attending's order, the drug administration sequence, the reasons, and the timing. She charted it clearly and completely because incomplete charting was how truth got lost in transition, and the truth of what had happened in Bay 3 between 2 and 3 in the morning was important enough to survive her discomfort about having it in the record. Dolores was finishing her own shift at the same time. They walked out together through the main entrance into the morning, which was cold and clear and smelled like rain that had stopped sometime around 5, the parking lot still wet and the sky the specific pale blue that came after a storm had cleared. Dolores said, "You going to be okay?" "Yes." "You need to eat something." "I know." Dolores stopped at her car and looked at her across the roof. "You were right tonight, from the first minute. You were right, and you held on to it, and you didn't fold when Finch pushed you, and that man is alive because of it." She opened her door. "I just wanted to say that out loud before we both go home and sleep, and the morning makes everything smaller." Lena nodded. She stood in the wet parking lot for a moment after Dolores drove away. The morning did make things smaller. She knew that. She'd seen it happen after the Corolla Valley and after other things that were harder to name, the way events that had been enormous in their occurrence contracted in the retelling, became manageable, became something that fit inside a normal-sized conversation between normal-sized people. And that was not entirely wrong, because the contraction was how people survived having done large things. But she was aware, standing in the parking lot of Mercy Hollow General at 8:15 in the morning with the cold coming through her scrub jacket, that tonight had been something she couldn't fully contract yet. Not because of Harmon, not because of Reyes, not because of the drive or the network or the arrests that were already being reported on the radio in someone's car across the lot. Because of the moment in Bay 3 when she'd picked up the atropine syringe and Finch had told her to put it down, and she hadn't. She'd spent 4 months at this hospital being the quiet one, the new one, the one who followed orders and stayed small and did not make anyone uncomfortable with the gap between what she knew and what her position entitled her to say. She had told herself that was wisdom, choosing battles, building trust, learning the environment. And some of it had been wisdom. But some of it had been something else. The habit of a woman who'd come home from a war and needed to take up less space for a while, which was understandable, which was human, and which had quietly calcified into a way of moving through the world that didn't belong to her anymore. She'd been carrying military knowledge in a civilian body and treating it like something to be apologized for rather than something to be used. And last night, a man had lived because she'd stopped apologizing for it at the exact right moment. She thought about what Dolores had said. Before the morning makes everything smaller. She thought about Harmon saying, "You're not hearing me." She thought about Finch in the lounge with his cold coffee and his 17 years and his honest acknowledgement that he'd stopped listening somewhere along the way. She thought about the 3 operatives who were safe because the right information had reached the right hands inside the right window. She thought about Adrian Reyes, who had looked at her in the corridor and assessed her as a variable and called her a loose end, and how that assessment had been the most important mistake he'd made all night. She'd been called a lot of things in her professional life. New nurse, young, inexperienced, too aggressive, too quiet, difficult, deferential. She had spent a significant amount of energy managing other people's perceptions of her in rooms where the official hierarchy didn't match the actual distribution of capability, and she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the 12-hour shift. She was tired of the management. She got in her car, and she sat there for a moment with her hands on the wheel, not starting it yet. Through the windshield, she could see the main entrance of Mercy Hollow General, the glass doors, the morning staff coming in for the day shift, the ordinary machinery of a hospital at the start of a day that would look nothing like the night that had preceded it. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered it. Vasquez? A woman's voice, precise, unhurried, authoritative in the way that came from position rather than effort. My name is Deputy Director Wainwright. I've been briefed on last night, and I wanted to make this call personally. She said nothing, waiting. The documentation of your treatment decisions and your actions regarding the drive are part of the official record and will remain part of it, Wainwright said. I want you to know that what you did, the clinical piece, the judgment piece, all of it, has been seen at the correct level. It won't disappear into a classified file. I appreciate that, Lena said. A pause. Admiral Harmon asked me to pass along something specific. He said, "She knows what Protocol 17 November means now." Lena looked at the hospital entrance. "What does it mean?" she said, because she still didn't know, not officially, and she thought she'd earned the answer. "It's the designation for an asset who has been identified as someone the network would trust with its most critical material," Wainwright said. "It's not a protocol. It's a classification. It means, if this person tells you something matters, it matters." Another pause. "He's never used it to identify a civilian before." Lena sat with that for a moment. She thought about a 24-year-old medic in the Kerala Valley, keeping 4 people alive under fire and catching something a surgeon had missed, and being told good job and sent home, and spending the next 3 years making herself smaller in rooms where she'd already proven she was the most capable person in them. She thought about being a loose end. She thought about being the right person in the wrong moment, and then turning out to be the right person in exactly the right moment, and how nobody had made her that. She'd just arrived, already built, already capable, already everything she needed to be, waiting in a hospital in West Virginia for a November night that required all of it. "Tell him thank you," she said, "for the 30 seconds. Wainwright said, "He said you'd say something like that." She ended the call. She started the car. She pulled out of the Mercy Hollow General parking lot in the early morning light, and she drove home through a town that didn't know what had happened in its hospital overnight and didn't need to. And she thought about what came next. Not with anxiety, not with the specific tiredness that had been following her since she'd come home from the army and taken up less space as a survival strategy. With something cleaner than that. She had spent 4 months being the nurse who followed orders and stayed quiet, and last night she had been exactly who she actually was for approximately 6 straight hours, and the experience of it, the clarity of it, the particular simplicity of knowing exactly what you were doing and why, was something she hadn't felt in 3 years. She had missed it, in the way you miss something that was part of your actual architecture rather than a preference or a skill. You could spend a long time being underestimated. You could be patient with it, strategic with it, manage it gracefully and professionally and without bitterness. You could give people the benefit of the doubt when they looked at you and saw something smaller than what was there. But the underestimation was never the truth of you. It was only ever the failure of their observation. The truth of you was what happened when the moment required it. She drove home through the morning, and the truth of her was exactly what it had always been, undamaged and specific and entirely her own, and she was finally done apologizing for the size of it.